big company can never provide a personalized, hands-on experience.
How do you take on a giant company like Google Maps and win?
If you build a good product, you build good relationships with the customers. When there are fires, more often than not, the customers become your allies when there are problems because you were their allies when they had problems.
What is your secret sauce, Luke?
I think.
Luke Seelenbinder, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ryan. It's great to be on.
Let's kick things off with something spicy. So you're an American citizen, but you decided to set up your company in Estonia. Why?
Estonia is a fun place to do business. My history with Estonia actually started quite a long time ago. I discovered it through this program they have called E-Residency, which allows you to sign up and create a company in Estonia. I became an e-resident simply because I was fascinated with the idea of a government trying to do something, one, for people outside their borders, because this program's exclusively for people who are not Estonian, and second, that a government was trying to innovate, trying to create new ways to do business, because I don't know about you, but me as an American, that's not a particularly common idea, is that the government's working for me instead of I have to work kind of with the government, try to figure out how to do things. So about 8 years ago, I discovered this program. I became an e-resident just to support the idea. I was living in the US. I had no real use for it. And then 7 years ago, I ended up relocating to Europe. And when I did that, I wanted to create a separate entity to run my business through. I was working as a consultant at the time, so I had quite a few clients, and I wanted them to have kind of a stable entity regardless of where I lived physically, and just make it really easy to send invoices and understand kind of that client relationship, so they didn't have to worry about where I was living. So I ended up choosing Estonia to create this company. And at this point, I had visited a few times. I'd started going to conferences. I'd met quite a few Estonians and started to understand the actual background and the reason why it's so easy to do business in Estonia. If you look at the history of Estonia, about 30 years ago, they got their independence back from the Soviet Union, and they were left with a government they had to recreate from scratch. There were no services. There was nothing. They were basically getting to reinvent a country from scratch. And they made a lot of really good decisions early on. And one of those was to create a purely digital government services idea. Obviously, they started with little pieces, and as they built up, everyone became more and more confident in digital first. It started with an identity card that tied everything together in all the government systems. One of the rules of thumb when you work with the Estonian government is they say they should only ever ask you a question once. So if the government knows this fact about you, they don't have to ask you ever again because all the systems are interconnected. For instance, if you enter your address on one form, you don't have to then re-enter it on every other form. Imagine that, right?
Wow.
And what's ended up happening is because everything's online and everything's easy to use, it's really novel for someone outside. When you understand the level of bureaucracy in many European countries versus Estonia, it's just mind-blowing to people that they don't have to send physical mail. They don't have to go to notaries to change the way their business runs or add shareholders, remove shareholders, things like that. The whole process of running a business actually takes less time than it's taken me to explain why I did this. Most of the things I do take less than a minute. Filing taxes often is just a very simple process. Monthly accounting is the same. And top it off, a lot of the services are quite a bit cheaper here than, for instance, in the US, like accounting, bookkeeping, things like that. And so it just creates a really simple environment, fast, that I can use to run my company.
Just diving into that a little bit, because I'm always fascinated about other places in the world, like being geographically flexible. I did a bit of a stint as a digital nomad, so I spent a bit of time looking into this stuff. But in terms of banking options with an Estonian company, financial services, because the big fear I think a lot of people have is, okay, well, let's say I set up a company, I go through all the hoops and all that kind of stuff, and then I can't get a bank account. What do I do now? How does that work?
Yeah, it is sometimes a problem for people. Essentially, banking you can think of as two broad categories of banks. You have traditional banks, which is where you probably have access to a traditional payments account.
Hmm.
You can probably get a debit card, credit card perhaps. You can also get loans, things like that. It's kind of traditional banks, brick and mortar type setup. But there's also quite a few fintechs. The ability to get a bank account is usually quite easy at a fintech. If you're physically residing in a country or you're a
Mm.
citizen of a country that's not on any blacklists or things like that, it's quite straightforward to get a fintech, whether that's Wise or Revolut or any number of the options.
Hmm.
Getting a traditional bank account in Estonia can be a little bit more complicated. It's I've never had trouble myself. I have a friend who basically talks about treating it like a job application because what the bank is looking at you is they're trying to reduce their risk. So anything you can do to help that bank understand you're running a legitimate business, you have a legitimate plan to do business in Estonia and perhaps even with Estonian companies, it becomes. But that is sometimes more difficult for people. But at the end of the day, most of the time, a small business doesn't need that. And if
Hmm.
you're a bigger business, you already have all those pieces in place to establish legitimacy and reduce that risk for the bank. So I've never had a problem with banking really solving any of the problems I've had.
That makes sense. We might dive into the Estonian e-residency program and the pros, the cons, the details, all that kind of stuff in a little bit more depth later on. But why don't we back up a little bit, and maybe if you could tell us a little bit about your business, StadiaMaps. So, what is StadiaMaps and who is it for?
StadiaMaps is a maps and location API platform for developers. We help businesses, typically businesses who don't do a lot with geospatial data, add location to their product. This could look like a interactive map, kind of in their apps. Imagine like a booking platform showing you all the hotel options you have on a map as opposed to just a list. Or it could be some kind of back office process, something like turning addresses into coordinates so then you can run statistics on those coordinates, or turning coordinates into addresses so you know where these points are on a physical map so that you can show it to the user. For instance, let's say you're a ride hailing company and you know where the person is, and typically you start their search with kind of where they are and you show an address for that. Well, at some point you have to turn that coordinate where they are physically GPS to an address, and
Mm.
that's a process called geocoding or reverse geocoding for that. Um, so we have a lot of these different kinds of APIs put together in a package on our platform, so a developer doesn't have to go looking for a new provider every time. They just come to us. They say, I need maps, I need search, things like that, and we have it for them.
You mentioned just when we were talking before, you mentioned a story about how you were saving the grannies from the semis. Like, what do you mean by that? Can you unpack that a little more?
So one of the services we provide is a routing API. And a routing API at the core of it is finding the best way to get from point A to point B.
Hmm.
There's lots of nuances to that, but you can choose to get from point A to point B by walking. You can choose biking. You can choose a car. You can choose a truck. Any option. Um, and a few months ago, we had a really interesting inquiry come in. To add a little bit of context, there's communities, especially in the US, where golf carts, yes, the same thing you drive around a golf course, are a primary mode of transportation. And within these communities, they have specialized paths for them. They typically have regulation that applies to the golf carts, but not to other forms of transportation. For instance, cars and bikes don't have the same rules. Speed limits are different, things like this. Um, and each of these communities had a navigation app, so they help their residents get from point A to point B inside the community. And when they're driving golf carts, they were having a problem. People were getting routed on the worst roads for golf carts. You literally had grannies on 6-lane divided highways where the speed limit was 55 miles per hour or more. And that sounds like a problem to me. And of course, if this is an app provided by the local municipal government, it's a real big problem for them when they're basically telling users to break the law and put themselves in unsafe situations. So what we were able to do is create a kind of a custom routing profile, it's called, for golf carts, so that the golf carts would drive on the right roads, so that users would get accurate ETAs, and so that grandma wouldn't get run over by a semi.
I don't know about you, Luke, but my grandma was an absolute hoon. She was a lead foot. She would slam the foot down on the accelerator. So maybe she was the only one able to keep up, but maybe she's a bit of an
Believe it
exception.
or not, some of these golf carts aren't just electric; they're actually gas powered, and they could go that speed.
Oh wow!
So it's kind of a big problem when you get the inverse, where you have these golf carts that could go 50 miles an hour, and they do, and they're on like pedestrian paths. So they were really having this problem both ways because people are crazy.
Oh, jeez. Well, tell me a bit about the origin story, because it sounds like there's a lot of different applications for your product and your technology. But you mentioned back when we were talking about the e-residency program, you said you had a consulting company based in Estonia.
Mhm.
Like, connect the dots for me. What, like, how did you
Yeah.
get started? How did that turn into StadiaMaps?
StadiaMaps kind of started for two reasons. One, my co-founder and I were both entrepreneurial, and we were looking for an idea. We wanted to do something that was our own. Consultants don't have a lot of kind of power when it comes to what they do. They kind of do what the company asks them to do, and we don't get the opportunity to build what we want to build.
Mm-hmm.
So we were looking for a project to do together. And at the time, we were working with a company that did media streaming, audio, video, things like that. And the people that would broadcast were all displayed on a map. They were using Google Maps. It cost nothing. Everything was good. And then Google Maps decided to make a pretty significant pricing change, basically monetize a product that used to be free.
Mm-hmm.
And their bill was going to go from $0 to $700 a month. And this kind of discovery page was not worth $700 a month. And they were just going to turn it off because there was no way they were going to pay $700 a month to keep it going. So my co-founder and I looked at this problem and said, well, how hard could it be? Little did we know it could be really hard. But we went off and built the first map integration. So we kind of built maps first. That was our reason to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And then shortly thereafter, we added routing. And it ran as a side project, kind of a side gig.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we spent 20-40% of our time on it for 4 to 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then we hit a kind of a stopping point. We realized that it was going really well, but not well enough. And if we wanted to go to the next step, we needed to go full time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we looked at the options and we said, well, what if we raise a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
What if we jump in and go full time and go all in on this project? So we're able to raise some money, and we'll talk more about that later, but ended up raising money, going full time, and really taking this from a project with a couple APIs to a full-fledged platform in the last year and a half, 2 years, and really round it out to where we can solve 80 to 90% of the market's needs. And we're still a three-man company, so that's been pretty cool.
Okay, so I want to ask you something very specific. What is your secret sauce, Luke? Like, how do you take on a giant company, or a giant division of a company like Google Maps and win? Hey, it's Ryan here. I'm glad you're enjoying the video. Listen, if you want to meet me or some of the people that I interview, you should really join the StartupSauce SaaS founder community. It's a private Slack group for SaaS founders based outside of Silicon Valley who are past the idea stage and want to focus on growth. About 30% of our members are doing over $1 million a year in revenue, so it's a pretty high caliber group. You'll get access to regular mastermind calls and workshops, and every week we share exclusive marketing tactics and resources that you can use to grow your business faster. So, if you want to give yourself an unfair advantage and learn from other SaaS founders who are 1 or 2 steps ahead of you, head over to startupsauce.com and sign up. I think there's a link in the description down below as well. Anyway, I'll see you in there.
Well, there's one way that's really easy, and that's you realize that a big company can never provide a personalized, packaged, hands-on experience. A big company can't answer their email in 24 hours because they'll never dedicate the resources to do it. And so the way we've been able to take on like a Google Maps or any number of our other competitors who are all quite a bit bigger is we focus on building a really good product. And then because the product works, it's really easy to provide a really good support experience. We answer email, we are available for calls, things like that. And it sounds counterintuitive in the sense that, well, you're a small company, so you don't have time to provide this really great support. But we actually find that because we value it so highly, we're able to do it at a better, more consistent quality than the big players. Specifically in mapping, when you look at the history of map data, it's always been a really capital intensive process, gathering and making maps. When you think about how big the world is, when you think about just the history of map making going back 400 or 500 years, it used to be people getting on ships, going out and sailing the coastline and drawing in books. And that's where we got our maps. So every single map cost the equivalent of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars just to create a map of, let's say, the east coast of the US.
Mm-hmm.
But today, we actually have the opposite in the sense that map data, especially what you need to create what are called base maps. Base maps are the things that have cities, streets, parks, basically the basic map data on it.
Mm-hmm.
The data you need to create these maps is essentially free. There's projects like OpenStreetMap,
Mm-hmm.
which are kind of like Wikipedia for maps. Anyone can edit it. That exist with very lenient license terms, so you can take their data, create a commercial service on top of it,
Mm-hmm.
and all you need to do is credit them. And that's what's happened in the last, especially 5 years, is a lot of providers have sprung up based around OpenStreetMap. And so what used to be a capital intensive process is now the data's there, figure out how to use it, figure out how to build services on top of it. So when you look at a closed provider like a Google, they still have to do the capital intensive process of gathering the data themselves. That's why you see these fleet of Street View cars going around. Of course, they have better data. They have, in many places, they have more data is probably the better way to say that than just better data.
Mm-hmm.
They have images, they have 3D views.
Mm.
But when you look at the fundamentals of mapping, that data is as good in OpenStreetMap, and it's free. So we can focus on delivering really high quality services as opposed to where we get the data.
And how do you translate that into a business advantage? So you mentioned, like, if you build a really good product, you can deliver a really good support experience, and sort of a bit of a paradox there where you think that even though you're a smaller company, you can still deliver better support because Google's never going to make that a priority. But is there anything else there that in terms of your business advantage versus someone? Why would someone pick you over Google Maps, for example?
Well, of course, being more cost effective is always an easy win. We can, because we focused on kind of what our unit costs are, we've been able to deliver really good unit cost to the customer. But when you compare it against other providers, we've kind of built data privacy into our platform from the beginning. We don't build products on top of what users do. You can imagine that when you have lots and lots of users using your map, using your routing APIs, using your search APIs, you could put together a pretty accurate picture of where the user is, what the user wants, and kind of where they've been. And there's a big privacy problem there. It's not that that data isn't valuable, because it is, but because we focus on privacy, we're not doing that. And that's something we can't really say for our competitors. So when data privacy is important, picking us makes a lot of sense. And then we've also focused on making our APIs as flexible as possible. Like we talked about making the golf cart routing profile a few minutes ago. We were actually able to get really, really close to what we needed for that just using our basic APIs with a lot of tuning, things that are accessible to our end user. So because we're willing to kind of leave the APIs open and kind of leave the knobs there for people to tune themselves, people are able to come in, and especially developers are able to come in and create a custom experience on our platform without us having to do any extra work, and really puts the power back in the hands of the people creating the products as opposed to the companies trying to create a platform that is locked down, or you can only do what they want you to do.
And if it's Google too, like the bedrock of that is how do we inject more ads into this experience somehow, so you've got a lot more freedom if you don't have to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've had conversations with customers where essentially if they use Google Ads, they're putting a ad surface for their competitors in their product, whether that's their website, the worst place to put an ad for your competitor, or right in their app. I mean, imagine a company like, I don't know, like Burger King putting a map in their app, and then all the McDonald's sites are highlighted. I don't think that's the end result they want. But that's essentially what you get, unless you pay quite a high figure to get a mega corporation to customize their product. if they'll even do it for you.
What was the trigger point? You mentioned before that you raised capital because you wanted to go full time, but what was the actual was there a key decision that led you to deciding to raise capital and go full time on the business? Was there a metric? Was there a revenue figure that you wanted to hit? Was there something that you looked at that said, okay, we need to go big or go home now?
I wouldn't say we looked at it so much from a metrics perspective as much as we sense that there's something good. We think that we can do something good. We look at the industry and it seems like there's room for us to create something really good here. And kind of an accident of life happened too. Both my co-founder and I were consulting at the same company, and that company folded, laid off all their engineers, almost all their engineers all at once. And we were both left with 2 weeks notice and nothing to do, no project that followed. And so then saying, well, I'm going to go raise money is probably not the best idea. I wouldn't recommend it, but it ended up working out. And we were able to pretty easily jump from that 20-40% commitment to 100% invested. And we knew kind of before we made that decision, like we'd already been talking about kind of what's the next step. And the next step initially was to raise money in the sense that we put away savings so we could kind of fund ourselves to go full time. But because of the way the timing happened, we ended up having to raise money. Having to raise money sounds kind of negative, and it actually turned out to be really positive because some of our biggest deals since then have come through those investors. So they've brought value to the table beyond just the money they invested.
How did you find those investors out of curiosity? Did you have a network of investors already in place? Was it friends and family? Was it, how did you find those investors in the first place?
I think kind of that running that game it's definitely a numbers game. We didn't have a network in place. I knew one angel investor who is really good at it, and I called him up and I said, "Should we do this?" And he was like, "Yes, and I'll be your first investor." And then he made a bunch of introductions. Those introductions made introductions, and of course we heard no a lot. And it was really crazy how it ended up coming together because we got 3 or 4 angels together. We were planning to focus on angel investors, and we talked mostly to angel investors. And then one of the angel investors had committed. They ran it through kind of a competitive check with their employer. Their employer said no. We actually have no idea why their employer said no. But because they couldn't invest, they actually introduced us to the VC that ended up investing in us. Because their employer said no, we ended up getting the vast majority of the money from a single VC that we would have never would have been introduced to anyways. And then the best part there was I think we had the initial kind of email conversation with the VC in like October, maybe October, November, and then it just went dead. So you're like, well, I guess just like everybody else, they just didn't answer. And then 3 months later, right as we were getting to the end of the angel investment we had gotten, and we were like, what do we do now? Do we start pulling out money out of our own bank accounts? They followed up and they were like, we're so sorry, we lost this email. And we ended up getting investment from them, I think, in like 2 or 3 weeks, which put us over the line and gave us enough capital to keep going. But it's really fun to see how it's usually the random happenstance of life that brings these things together, which is why you need a lot of numbers because you never know who's going to be interested.
And just giving yourself more opportunities. I had a I had a
Exactly.
I had a mentor once who said that there's no such thing as a silver bullet. There's just a shitload of lead ones. That's always stuck with me. You just need to give yourself more opportunities, and eventually someone will say yes. So that makes a
I
lot of
think
sense.
someone smart put it this way, where they said, you want to increase your luck surface area. You want to increase the opportunities
Mm.
for luck to happen, and that's what we've tried to do. Is always give ourselves enough room to take the opportunities as they came.
What is Ferrostar?
Well, remember saving grandma from the semis? Well, when grandma's driving around with her app, that whole experience is called navigation. So routing is the nuts and bolts of getting you from point A to point B, but navigation is actually the user experience. It's showing you the list of directions. It's showing you a pin on a map. You're here. The line for where you're needing to drive is here. This is your next turn. And then as you proceed along the route, does updates, you get voice instructions, et cetera, et cetera. This whole experience is called navigation. And as we were helping the company create the golf cart routing profile, we realized that the open source solutions for navigation were really, really bad. They were either 10 years old and really buggy, or they were closed source and you had to go to a company who would come back with a 5, 6, 7, 8-figure annual budget and say, well, how much do you actually want to do this? Because we believe our navigation SDK is the best. And that's kind of where we realized maybe there's more than just this company. So my co-founder started working on this project called Ferrostar, which is an open source nav SDK. It's designed to be composable, so you can bring the map that you want. You can bring the navigation or the routing provider you want. For instance, you could use StadiaMaps, you could use one of our competitors, you could do it on the device. But what it provides you is the framework you need for that navigation experience. It starts with a bunch of defaults, so if you just drop it in the app, you're going to have defaults that make sense. But then as you need to customize it, there's all the hooks you need to do that. And because most nav SDKs are designed to be used by a single provider, they make a lot of assumptions. They assume you're using that provider for the routing. They assume you're using that provider for the mapping. And so by the time you're done, there's none of these hooks for customization. So instead, we're building something that's starting open source, that's starting kind of vendor and map provider agnostic. And while it doesn't sound very smart for a location platform to create this, where it's agnostic and you can use anyone, we have consistently seen that when you build something in the open, you can do a whole lot more than you could do just with your own resources.
Can you unpack that a little bit more? Is it because you can get other developers jumping in and building stuff on top of it, or is it or contributing to it? Like I think a lot of companies are sort of a little bit reluctant about going down the open source path because you're kind of giving away the keys to the kingdom a little bit, aren't you?
You have to think about what are the keys to the kingdom, because software is fundamentally hard to create. And we ourselves are built on a lot of open source. So we understand the power of open source to create business value. When you look at kind of the building blocks of our platform and many even of our competitors' platforms, it's all open source. And they all exist. We still exist. And there's something there that's not the software, which is where we where we think there's actually the value in creating the software. So when you start open source, what you mentioned is absolutely true. More developers jump on. When companies have the problem that you're trying to solve, and they're like, well, we can contribute a little bit, they jump on, provide resources, provide engineers, and start building. But it goes deeper than that, because when you've kind of been at the center focal point of building a project, you know it the best. You get to direct how it goes. We're not building this right now as like an open community. We're still kind of the benevolent dictators for life of this project. And when you look at successful open source projects, many of them have had kind of this benevolent dictator for life type entity, whether it's a person or whether it's a company. And you can see it provides a lot of stability, but it also does allow us to tailor it for our customers' needs. And then because we know it the best, what we'll be able to build on top of it, what we'll be able to provide as far as service. Because imagine that you're building a significant part of your app around this navigation SDK. You're probably going to need more support than just a bug report in GitHub or something like that. And so there's a lot of value we can provide that's more than just the software. I mean, you look at Linux and how many companies have sprung up around the Linux core that are billion-dollar companies. There's tons and tons of them. So there's certainly a model that works for open source that leaves plenty of value to be delivered as a business.
That makes a lot of sense. When you explain it like that, it's really clear. I didn't realize you had so much control over it, or how much you can kind of, being a benevolent dictator for life. I love that. Let's switch tack a little bit. I wanted to explore that Estonian E-Residency program in a little bit more detail. You're a spokesman for that, correct?
Yeah. So last year they started a spokesperson program, because as you know, when someone from the organization tells you how great the organization is, it doesn't always ring so true. They're getting paid to do that. But when you have people who aren't paid to say something, it comes a lot more real and a lot more truthful. And I mean, I've met many of these spokespeople over the last few months, and every single one of us, I think, was already doing what we're doing now inside the official program because we've had such success with the residency program, because life is so much easier having a company in Estonia versus anywhere else we've had a company. Of course, we talked about it. And so this is just kind of going the other direction of saying, yes, these people are actually saying the right things as far as they understand how it works. They're not trying to rip anyone off. Yeah, they're not trying to fudge things. And so they know what they're talking about. And that's kind of where I'm at now. Is I'm part of the official program, spokesperson program, because I love to talk about it so much. I love to go to conferences and talk about it. I love to just sit down with people and say, how can you use e-residency to make your life easier?
What are some of the common misconceptions about the residency program?
I think the biggest misconception is it is entirely electronic. It's entirely online. There's no visa component. There's no residency permit. There's nothing as far as like the physical access to Estonia. It's all about the digital access to their government services. You get a ID card. It looks like just like a credit card with a chip, and you pick that up. You make the application. Usually it takes a couple of weeks, and then you actually pick that up in a embassy or consulate near you. So you never actually have to go to Estonia physically. You just have to visit one of their representations. And once you have that ID card, you get, like I said, digital access to all the services. It's nothing to do with actually visiting the country or getting the right to reside in the country. It's entirely electronic.
Right. So if you're not an EU citizen, so I'm Australian, for example, if I went down the residency program pathway, that wouldn't in and of itself give me the right to reside in Estonia or other European
Right.
countries. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any other misconceptions, like about tax rates or about anything else to do with the program?
Yeah, it doesn't affect your individual tax residency whatsoever, because legally you can think of it as you're running a company in another country, which is something that most people could already do like before e-residency was a thing. It just was a lot harder. You had to have a power of attorney, you had to have a notary or something like that in the country where you're running the company. It wasn't so popular to do. But it's so because you're just running a company in another country, there's nothing with your personal taxes that are affected. It could even be that the company itself is not tax resident in Estonia. It is by default, but depending on how your business runs exactly, kind of where your employees are, where your customers are, if you're shipping physical products, where those physical products are stored and shipped from, etc. It could be that you have an Estonian company that's tax resident in Germany or tax resident in the US or something like that. There's definitely the tax complexities that come along with it. But as I tell everyone, I'm an American citizen. I have to deal with US tax complexity anyways. If I had a company outside the US, I'd have the exact same procedure with any place. So why not choose a place where it's the easiest to run the company? Because I still have the headache of taxes. So I might as well make the company as easy to run as possible.
That makes a lot of sense. Who mostly takes up that program? You know, I don't know if you've got any official statistics or just from anecdotally. Is it mostly Americans? Is it other people within Europe? Is it people outside of Europe?
Yeah, I actually have quite a few statistics we can go through if you want to.
Yeah.
The biggest by number right now is actually Ukraine, because obviously doing business in Ukraine right now is very difficult. They're not part of the EU either. So when a Ukrainian wants to sell services in the EU, they typically create an entity in the EU, which Estonia is in the EU. So having an Estonian company means you have an EU entity. I think it's about 30, 40, maybe 50% of e-residents actually running a company are in the EU. So they're Germans or they're in Spain or Italians, etc. And typically the reason those people choose Estonia is the ease of doing business. There's tons of examples of crazy things that you have to do to run a company in some of these countries. For instance, I learned recently that when you name your Spanish company, you don't name your Spanish company. You give the Spanish government three or four options of what you think your company should be called, and then they write back to you after a certain number of weeks with what your company is named. That kind of blew my mind. Another example is in Germany. Basically, anytime you want to do anything, change anything about how your company is run, how the shareholders are structured, anything, you have to go to a notary. And of course, you have to go to a notary in Germany, or you have to go through another process to make that all happen. So there's lots of reasons why EU citizens end up creating a company in Estonia, because it's so much easier, so much faster. Another big problem is getting VAT numbers. So sometimes getting a VAT number in a country can take 4, 6, 8 weeks, and you can't bill anyone until then. So if you have a contract that starts today and you need to bill them today so you can live for the next few months, people need a quick solution. And then outside of the EU, so these are people who reside somewhere else typically, or they're from somewhere else and they might reside in the EU. There's a lot of different reasons why people do it. A lot of Americans do it for ease of doing business, or to get access to the EU in an easier way than with a US company. Other countries, for instance, where it's difficult to get banking systems to interact with Western banking, countries such as India, or I'm trying to think of a few more examples, but sometimes it can be very difficult to actually get payments cross-border between those countries. Turkey is another example, where there's either capital controls or there's actually just a lot of financial crime issues. So if they're able to kind of prove that they're legitimate and they get Estonian E-Residency and then they prove to the bank they're legitimate, then they have a European bank, and it's a lot easier to interact with the rest of the Western financial system from an EU entity than it is from their kind of home country.
That makes a lot of sense. Don't get me started on the Argentinian system. Love this country. It's great. But oh my God, trying to get anything done in terms of the bureaucracy is on another level, and trying to bank with any transactions into or out of Argentina are just a real pain in the butt. So maybe that.
And there you have it.
And that's the reason. Who would you say is best suited? Like, what are the particular kinds of businesses that are ideally suited for e-residency? So, for example, if you're funded versus not funded, or if you're offering services versus e-commerce versus software versus something else, like what do you see as being like the ideal? What's the ICP for the ideal customer profile for the residency program?
Certainly, a lot of them are digital nomads. It makes sense that if you have something that's entirely online, you never have to go anywhere physically to run your company, that it's an ideal fit for someone who's a digital nomad. Those digital nomads might be one-person companies, that might be multiple coming together, but typically that's a really strong use case when you want to be location independent. Another big use case is getting that EU access. So if you're a company that wants to export goods or services to the EU, having an entity in the EU makes a lot of sense. It tends to favor things that are digital as opposed to things that are physical. If you're running a business shipping goods, importing goods, things like that, and you're not explicitly trying to do that in the Estonian market, probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because by the time you're done, you're going to be creating entities in all the countries where you're doing that physical business. So that doesn't make as much sense. But if it's services, like I said, you can sell to the EU. So having an easy way to get your foot in the door. There's another spokesperson who created an AI company based in Sri Lanka that creates a lot of AI solutions for a lot of really well-known companies here in Europe. And kind of how he got his foot in the door is by creating a company in Estonia and using that to sell to the Nordics and Germany and really all over European Union.
And if you want to raise capital, is it easy to get people to invest into an Estonian company, or is that something? Are you better off having a separate company somewhere else for the purposes of raising capital?
Yeah, in my case, we ended up using a American entity to raise the capital. The reason for that is all our investors were American. There's a certain degree of comfort with the Delaware C Corp, things like that. However, the ecosystem here is really, really good. If you do want to raise capital, I would certainly consider doing it in Estonia. There's lots of good VCs. The narrative around Estonia is certainly really, really positive when it comes to investment. There's quite a few of basically the ecosystem is another fun story about Estonia, like how the startup ecosystem got created. There was one success. Everyone's heard of it. Skype.
Skype, yeah.
So Skype was created, I think it was 25 years ago now, something like that, and it was the first. It was like a UK Estonian startup, and when they exited, they created a bunch of startup investors here in Estonia. Those investors invested in a bunch of companies. Those companies went on to become unicorns.
Mm,
It's kind of the second generation are companies like TransferWise, now Wise, Taxify, now Bolt. Um, Pipedrive is another one.
hmm
Then those companies, their founders started reinvesting the money in the same ecosystem. So you kind of got this founders investing in other founders. So it's not just bankers bringing money and saying,
mm,
do something. It's founders who know what it's like to go build something. They know what it's like to be in the trenches and need the capital and know really how to spend the capital. Um, so it's a little bit different in the sense that
smart money.
a lot of yeah, it's smart money, and it's also really dedicated money. I've heard it
Mm,
said that if a company in Estonia gets funded and the founders want to see it through, they typically get the bridge rounds, they get the extra money
mm,
when they need it to kind of see it through to its conclusion. Basically, if you get funded, you're not going to fail because you ran out of money, unless it was a bad idea. Of course, it's a bad idea sometimes, and everyone's like, okay, we're done. But if there's actually any hope and you want to see it through, then typically you're able to. If you want to be a nitty gritty, hardworking startup founder, then I think getting capital here is a little bit harder.
yep.
But once you get it and once you prove kind of yourself
Mm.
and your own work ethic, it leads to really good results overall.
Okay, so in the same way that in the US you had the PayPal mafia, I think they called them, where PayPal was a huge success story. Lots of
Yep.
people got minted out of that. They invested in the next
Yep.
batch of startups. They invested in the next generation of startups. So,
Exactly.
so Estonia's got a similar thing going on now after
The
the
Skype
success of
mafia.
Skype, the Skype mafia. Okay,
It's what they're called. So
there we go. There we go. Um, Luke, what advice would you give to SaaS founders who are up against big competitors with deep pockets? Competing against a Google Maps, for example.
I think it's really the same I would give to anyone who's going up against the big players. You look for where they can't serve the market. And there's a few different ways that can happen. That can happen in support. It's how willing are you to kind of get dirty and help the customer kind of solve their problems? How much time are you willing to invest? And really, how well do you know those customers? Because when you think about a big corporation, it's composed of a lot of people, and those people probably are a few layers or 10, 20 layers removed from the customer. And when you're a small founder, you can sit on a call with the person who's implementing your solution or using your solution and understand their challenges and work and really build a personal relationship with them and solve their problems directly. So that's really a killer edge you always have at the beginning.
Mm,
But then the second thing is when you think about a big corporation, if they have a new product and they launch it and they get 100 million in new revenue,
mm,
they might kill the project. Is it super successful? Is it going to make lots of money? Yes. Is it going to work for a company with a $2 trillion market cap?
mm,
Probably not. It doesn't even move anything above the bottom line. So when you're a small founder, you can find that 10 million, 15
mm,
million, 100 million opportunity and go for it and build a really good business
mm,
because you don't necessarily want to be a $2 trillion business.
mm. I know I've spoken to a few founders, a few friends of mine, and they said they freaked out. They found out they had a competitor. The competitor got a whole pile of funding. They had all this money come in from VCs, and they were freaking out, thinking, okay, well, I'm done now. Like, how am I possibly going to compete with that? They can outspend me on ads. They can outspend me on engineering. They can roll out new features faster. Like, I'm dead in the water. But almost inevitably, what ends up happening is that they have to take the product more and more and more, further up market to justify the valuation. So they've got to charge more money. So they've got to go after bigger customers with a more expensive product offering. and they end up vacating this kind of space at the bottom, which is a big space, and you can build a pretty significant business off that. But not if you've got VCs breathing down your neck to turn it into a $1 billion unicorn. I don't know if that's been your experience, but certainly that's a conversation that I've had a few times with a few different founders where they said I was freaking out at first, and then almost inevitably they have to move up market, which means that I end up with a whole bunch of customers coming to me because they're like, well, they quadrupled the pricing, so we need to find another solution, and that's a big opportunity, I think, for some of the smaller players. Would you agree with that? Would you disagree? What's your experience been?
Exactly that experience. When we started, one of our biggest competitors had taken VC funding, but it hadn't taken a lot,
Mm-hmm.
um, like reasonable amounts, I would say.
Mm.
And they were a good competitor in the sense that we felt like we could position against them.
Mm-hmm.
The pricing was reasonable, but a little bit more, and they had a really good product. Look at them today. They've taken hundreds of millions of dollars in funding from VCs that expect the world and nothing but the world. If you exit for less than 20 billion, then you're a failure type exits. And that competitor has done exactly what you said. They've gone up market. They've niched into specific industries where they're building solutions that look completely different than what they were doing at the beginning. They started as a company focused on developers, building a lot of open source tooling. They really, their product and software created in a way that the revolution of new mapping providers in the last
Mm.
10 years. The standards they created are still being used today, but I'm the on the board, the governing board of a project that's actually a open source spinout of one of their projects because they took an open source project that was open licensed and everyone used, and they made it closed license because they needed to make money.
Mm.
And so as you see that happening, um, you see developers get alienated, the people who actually build the products that use these tools, and you see um, decision makers get alienated because they see the bills go higher and higher and higher. They build a solution and then they run it for 2 months and they're like, we're going to go bankrupt if we keep running this solution. So yes, you can build a solution with those products, but it's going to bankrupt us. So is that really a solution?
Mm.
Um, which is kind of where we can slot in and say, we'll give you the help you need. We'll build a product that's good, that's priced in a way you can actually use it.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine that company building a product they want you to use instead of just charge you a lot to use it a little bit. And we'll still be there in 3 or 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, because we've been doing this for 8 years now, so we're
Mm.
not going away.
Luke, do you have any tools or books or resources that you would recommend to other SaaS founders?
Well, I could always plug StartupSauce here.
You don't have to, but I appreciate that.
I have a book I like to recommend that's kind of out of left field for most people. It's actually a book about investment. And it's written by a fund manager, kind of four other fund managers. It's a book called The Tao of Capital by Spitznagel. Um, and what he talks about is really drilling home the concept of time horizon and understanding that when you look at investment, when you look at where you're putting your resources, because fundamentally business is resource investment. It's not money, it's time,
Mm-hmm.
or it's money and time, I would say. And at the end, you want a certain outcome.
Mm.
And one of the illustrations he uses is trees. When you look at evergreen trees, especially firs and these slower growing ones, um, they tend to allocate resources in a very weird way, where at the beginning, they grow really, really slowly. Um, when you look at other trees in comparison to them, those trees spring up, they grow to 50, 60 feet tall, and then their growth kind of slows down. That's kind of where they max out. But when you look at fir trees, cedar trees, things like that, they put their roots down, they keep building their roots, and they're 10 feet tall, but they're still building roots. And after 50 years, after 100 years, then they really start growing. And when you look at the volume they add every year after that really long time horizon, Um, it's a crazy amount of volume compared to what they were doing at the beginning. And then when you turn that around and look at it from an investment standpoint and building a business, at the beginning, you're building a foundation. Um, look at it as a long time horizon. That's why we started this as a side project. And it's not that kind of get your money from a VC, start fast, validate the product is a bad idea. But there's more than one way to build a business.
Mm.
And when you look at some of the most successful businesses, they've taken this approach where they build really deep roots. They build a really great product. And then when they have the growth, it's so much easier because you're not trying to patch all the holes as you're growing. You're taking a ship that runs well and you're just selling it to more people. Um, and a fun thing about fir trees is they need forest fire to be planted. So when the cones drop, they don't open until they're kind of baked. So you imagine this natural disaster, it goes through a forest, it wipes out all the trees, and these trees that grew really, really fast, that have thin bark, that have shallow roots, they don't have the substance to withstand a forest fire.
Mm.
And then that's exactly when the cones open up and the fir
Mm.
trees start growing where there's no competitors. And you can, I mean, the applications to the business world are many. It's
Mm.
find a place where things were just destroyed or there's full opportunity and then use all the resources there to grow.
Mm.
Um, so I could talk for a long time about this approach
Mm.
to investing, to building a business. I think it's really an interesting approach to how you build a life of starting slow and then gradually, once you're ready, expanding quickly because you have the foundation to do that.
Which is kind of the total opposite of the the tech crunch advice, which is start with something, grow like crazy, spend 24 hours a day on it, and then 3 to 5 years later flip it to someone else, and then you can finally take a breath. I have a friend who said something that stuck with me once, and he said when you're building a startup, even if you're taking a slow growth approach, anytime you're building a new company, you're always short on both people, capital, time. Everything is in short supply. So it's not about just putting out fires all the time. It's about deciding, well, which fires can I leave burn, and which ones do I absolutely have to focus on and put out right now? Because that, and maybe your approach. I think what I'm getting is that if you put down deep enough roots and you've got enough substance in your business, then you don't have to worry. When those fires come along, you don't have to fear them. Sometimes that can be an opportunity to grow.
Absolutely. So it's either when you start, it's in the time where this industry was completely erased because of some unknown event. For
Mm.
instance, starting a travel company in 2020 is the worst idea. But I'm sure I could find examples of travel companies that started in 2020, and because they ended up surviving that crisis, they're now
Mm.
so much bigger than anyone who existed before that, et cetera.
Mm.
But it's also, like you said, it's if you build a good product, you build good relationships with the customers. When there are fires, first, they're not as big. They're
Mm.
not all consuming. They maybe be one part of your service. And then the customers, because hopefully they've had years of experience with you listening to their problems, they're not going to run away at the first sign of smoke. They're going to say, well, there's a problem. How do we fix this?
Mm.
And I found that more often than not, the customers become your allies when there are problems
Mm.
because you were their allies when they had problems. And that's how you build kind of long-term value is customers who almost care about your business more than you do because you've solved a big problem for them and you've done it consistently over months and years.
There's a lot of wisdom there, I think. Luke, it's been a pleasure, buddy. If anyone is interested in StadiaMaps or in Ferristar, the open source project you've got, how do they get in contact with you?
They are welcome to email me. Website's StadiaMaps.com, STADIA maps.com. And we're on pretty much everything social. We're on GitHub. So if you prefer LinkedIn, go there. If you prefer code, go to GitHub. And yeah, excited to have conversations with people who've discovered us.
Fantastic. Thanks again, mate. This was an absolute pleasure. Good to have you on the show.
Thank you.